So we're going to be making a sort of raga wub, kind of filthy drum and bass sound in Native Instruments Massive. The intention is for it to sound kind of like this by the end. So it's kind of got that gritty wub type sound. What I'll usually do in Massive when I'm creating a sound from scratch is go File, New Sound. This essentially allows us to work from a fresh palette and resets all of the parameters in Massive to their default state or their original state. Down the left hand side we've got oscillator types. These are basically signal generators, and we're able to blend the three of them together, or we can use 1, 2 or 3 and create our own blend in order to get a sound which is unique and draws upon different signal types. With the first oscillator, we're going to be aiming for something kind of sub-bass in terms of tone, and we're going to choose either sine square or sine triangle. When I first play that sound, you'll notice it's quite rich, and that's because the wavetable position at the moment is pointed directly over to the square wave, which is going to introduce kind of more reedy, a woody type sound, more harmonic overtones. If I bring that down to sine, what we've got is something a little bit purer, a smoother, lower frequency sound, which could be useful for like 808 bass, trap bass, that kind of thing. I'm going to bring it down in pitch by 2 octaves because this is going to be the low frequency content of the sound. And then I'm going to go on to add a second oscillator. I'm going to choose one of the analog electric wave types. This is purely because they're a little bit grittier, again more overtones in the sound. I'm going to go with drive 3, but we can choose any, and we can go back and pick and choose between different wave types later if we want to. Again, I'm automatically going to go down a couple of octaves, and this is purely because we're making a bass sound. And then I'm going to experiment with the wavetable position. I'm going to have it quite low to begin with. And it just adds that element of grit to the sound. I'm going to introduce a third oscillator, which is just going to add a little bit more kind of buzz, grit, distortion. I'm going to choose Kangaroo just because I particularly like that wave type, but Frozen, Vulgar are also quite good if we're going for something that's a bit more aggressive and fierce. So with Kangaroo, initially I'm going to go down by 1 octave because this is meant to add another texture to the sound. It isn't necessarily meant to be low end or bassy in terms of content. So it kind of gives that added dimension. If I take that out and play it again, the sound isn't quite as rich. And I might just bring the wavetable position down a bit and experiment with dropping by another octave as well to see how that works with the other 2 oscillators. Next thing we're going to look at is the envelope. The envelope allows us to shape a sound. By having a quicker attack, it means that when we trigger a note on our MIDI keyboard or using musical typing, as soon as we hit that key, the sound plays quite instantly. If we have a longer attack, the sound will fade in more gradually. We can exaggerate that a bit more. It kind of has a rise type effect. The 4th envelope's quite important because it shapes the overall sound. So everything runs into that 4th envelope in order for us to play with overall attack, decay, sustain and release. With the LFO, this is a low frequency oscillator. It allows us to add movement to a sound, and we're going to go for a kind of pulsing effect. So to begin with, I'm going to sync the LFO to the project tempo, whatever that might be. I'm going to go with quarter note, so we've got the sound moving, kind of a wub, which is in a quarter note fashion. And I've just gone with a sine wave, so it's kind of like an up and down pulsing. I'm going to map that to the filter, and we'll come back to the filters and their purpose in a moment. But to begin with, I'm just going to increase the amount of the LFO that's being attached to filter 1. oscillators, so all of our oscillators down the left hand side run into the filters. We've got two filters. We can either choose to run into the filters in serial, which means the sound will go through filter 1 and then into filter 2 afterwards, or we can run our oscillators into the filters in parallel, which means sounds will go equally into filter 1 and filter 2 simultaneously. I'm going to run them in serial. In this instance, I'm going to turn off the second filter, so each of our 3 oscillators will run into filter 1. You can kind of think of a filter as being like an EQ, so imagine a high pass EQ in Logic where we retain highs and remove low, or a low pass where we retain low frequency content and remove high frequency content. We've got those options here, so low pass, high pass. We're going to use the scream filter. The scream filter is quite interesting because it mimics a resonant peak, so it increases a particular frequency band. And that's useful because it's adding some fairly heavy distortion, and it works quite well for kind of aggressive, darker sounds. You hear now, if I bring up the amount that we're attaching the LFO to the cutoff, more of it, it's a bit brighter, less of it, duller. We can also change the overall cutoff positioning. I can go back into LFO and change speed, so I can go to 1/8 notes, kind of pulsing. What's really cool for drum and bass is usually 12ths. Kind of works well with the tempo that's quite often used. What we're also using is a mono bass sound in this instance. I'm going to go into voicing. At the moment the sound set's to polyphonic, which is akin to like a polyphonic ringtone where we can hear multiple sounds at once. This is useful if we're creating chords or pads. In this instance we're using a mono, or developing a mono bass sound, so I'm going to choose mono rotate. And what this allows us to have is almost like a glide or a portamento between different notes. So if I play C in a lower octave and then move to C 1 octave above, you'll hear that glide between the two notes, which is quite useful for chord changes or chord progressions in drum and bass. And gives it that a short glide between the two different notes. What I could also do to adapt the sound a little more is introduce effects. We've got an effects bank over in the top right corner of the synthesizer. We've got some tubes which add a little bit of further grit and drive to the sound. We can choose how much with the dry wet parameter, so wet obviously indicating more of the sound. That's maybe a little bit too much, I can bring that down. And the drive level is the amount of actual overdrive added to the sound. So again, that's maybe a little bit excessive, we'll bring that down. We have a second effects bank. I can add a little bit of depth to the sound, so we've got like a longer reverb, a smaller reverb. The dimension expander is quite unique to Massive. It almost gives like a small room verb type sound. By adding that and bringing down the size of the space and the dry wet balance, brings the sound to life a little bit more, gives it a bit of added texture and depth, and also gives us a bit of a wider stereo image. So yeah, that's kind of a Raga drum and bass sound using Native Instruments Massive.